Hi there. I'm happy that you're taking time to watch this short lecture about Masahiro Mori's notion of the uncanny valley. This will be the first of a series of short lectures that will take us from the notion of the uncanny valley into Schatzberg's consideration of instrumentalism versus ethical reflection when it comes to employing technology. And finally, we will see a couple of these examples by looking at the Steven Spielberg film, The Minority Report. But this short lecture will only be about the Mori article. The program is short, focusing on the uncanny and Mori's uncanny valley and how to avoid the uncanny valley. I hope you enjoyed the Mori article, though I would understand that it might be a bit more technically inclined for some of you literature scholars out there. But basically, the math is well within the bounds of anyone who understands arithmetical and geometrical progressions. That's what the graph is showing. There was one isolated dependent clause in Mori's explication, which I would like to draw your attention to. And that is, it was the beginning of a sentence, since. And then this dependent clause was kind of thrown away. But creating an artificial human is itself one of the objectives of robotics. Now, Mori was a professor of robotics, and he worked at a technical university. But it strikes me as interesting, even unusual, that this is assumed. This is an assumption. Well, of course, creating an artificial human is itself one of the objectives of robotics. Well, I mean, how is this any different than Nathan Bateman in Ex Machina, wanting to be a god? At any rate, I thought it was quite interesting, and I hope when you reread the article, you'll see it there and go, Or maybe not. Maybe you want to create an artificial human yourself. Okay, so Mori's article is short, sweet, straightforward, again, a bit obfuscated by technical language, although I don't read the original Japanese, of course, but the translator has done a superb job both in making a nice flow of prose and including parenthetic references to Japanese culture, which Mori, of course, would be quite familiar with. In climbing toward the goal of making robots appear human, our affinity with them increases until we come to a valley. That is his thesis in a nutshell. And that valley he calls the uncanny valley, after Freud's notion of the uncanny, wherewith something that you assume to be alive and organic turns out not to be alive and inorganic. And Mori goes a long way, I would argue, better than even Sigmund Freud, in explaining why we as living, breathing humans have that reaction. Mori begins with industrial robots who are just big greasy machines putting together things like automobiles and soldering bits on an integrated circuit board. Then he speaks of toy robots for children, and that this has an increasing affinity because they look more like people. might be an interesting element just to consider that children perhaps can have a more easy and stronger affinity for these artificial humans because they have an affinity for dolls and toys. Heck, I had a toy stuffed parrot that I was extremely fond of until I was like 8 years old. When it comes to the uncanniness, though, the analog that Mori employs is persons with physical disabilities. And this is actually a fine rhetorical flourish because he starts off with pieces, i.e. the artificial hand, and works his way up to the whole. So when we have a hand, looks kind of human, but you touch it, or a young woman holds that hand in a dark room and therefore screams. At any rate, when we realize it is artificial, we have a reduced affinity. We like it a bit less. And then he goes into a section that discusses a movement. And of course, there he begins with the artificial hand, which in 1970 was just coming online. Explaining the horror of going into a room full of mannequins. These are the dolls they put clothes on in store windows, and suddenly one of them moves, and you would be quite shocked. Think of J.R.'s home in Blade Runner, and you understand this business about moving mannequins being a bit strange. And then he talks about the slowly smiling face that imitates the 29 muscles that we use to smile. And when it is slowed up, it becomes a horrifying grimace. And you might think of Sophia showing her emotions when she is discussing Tony Robbins in the video. Mori, and this is, for my money, the stroke of genius, very clearly speaks of the uncanny valley as an integral part of our instinct for self-preservation. In other words, when we see something that is moribund, not living, imitating something that is living, we think of our own life and death. So in this respect, uncanniness is a somatic response. It's a bodily response in that we avoid that which resembles our own death and decay. Again, not for the last time, we will look at the chart here. I would go so far, however, to say that the illustration in Masahiro Mori's article is even better. It has more posts along the way, and it has marginal explanation as to why we experience the uncanny valley. Now, this is of extreme importance for video game designers, people who do CGI in films, and of course, people who build robots. So, Mori's article, while it is certainly a minor stroke of genius when it comes to describing the uncanny valley, its real value is in the implicit suggestions that we get out to how to avoid the uncanny valley. Might not be so much use to us as literary scholars, but as technicians and students of technology, I think this is worth having a look at. So, how does one overcome the uncanny valley? Well, Mori's advice is don't overdo it. Don't overdo the resemblance. Go ahead and stop at the first peak. Good enough is good enough. In this respect, perhaps Sophia has gone over the top a bit. If you get to the physical element and you attain perfection, in other words, you really put it over, it's likely that you can climb to the second peak, which, please note, is even higher than the first. Yes, if they perfect the artificial human, we will really, really like it. On the other hand, I mean, Deckard did fall in love with Rachel. Yeah, in the film, that is. In terms of physical uses, just keep construction to the bare utility. I think if Kyoko in Ex Machina wasn't also double-purposed to be Nathan Bateman's sex doll, she might not have been quite so dangerous in the end. In terms of digital interfaces, I believe, as I suggested in our seminar last week, that on the digital realm, such as on a screen I'm talking about, or in a virtual reality environment, attaining perfection could be easier. It would require less processing. You don't have to imitate the bodily movements. You don't have to use all of that processing power to push a cleverly designed device through space and make it appear human. Finally, on the digital realm, you can and this is a technique in game design. You accentuate one aspect and you make it recognizably human, but it's still a bit different. In other words, you're not trying to be a human, but you're giving a human-like characteristic and creating an emotional affinity by featuring a human aspect, but at the same time making the creature obviously not a human. An example here is blue people in Avatar, and the creature of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings films. And I don't know how you enjoyed the Lord of the Rings films, but I would, in my viewing of them, and I've seen the series now a few times, I actually do have a lot of empathy for that creature. But not as a human being in appearance, but a human being in his strengths and weaknesses. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention. The next lecture will be about Schatzberg's concluding chapter to his book on technology. Bye for now.